That morning on Mercer Ranch began with the burnt smell of something Hank Mercer no longer had a name for. He only knew it had once been eggs, then turned into a black layer fused to the bottom of the pan, as if daring the fire to do its worst. Smoke curled upward, slipping through every seam of the kitchen walls, stinging his eyes. Hank wiped his forehead and tried to pry the mess loose with a steel spatula, whose edge had long been chipped. It didn't budge. He didn't know why he kept trying. Pride, maybe, or simple exhaustion at losing to his own kitchen every morning. In the crackle of the fire, he let out a long breath, his broad frame casting a heavy shadow across the wooden table. Then hoofbeats stopped outside the porch. A moment later, Thomas Wilson's voice carried through the kitchen door. "Hank, you alive in there? With smoke like this, the Apache might think your place is under attack." Before Hank could answer, Thomas stepped inside with a young woman following behind him. She held back a little, her frame lean but steady, her simple dress carrying the dust of the road. Her smooth brown skin caught the early light in a way that made Hank blink once. Slow. Thomas laughed as he took in the scene. "I brought you a gift straight from the Lord," he said. Then he pointed toward the woman. "Althea Rivers. She's looking for work, and judging by that pan, you surely need her." Hank hadn't managed a response when Althea stepped forward and looked straight at the smoldering ruin in the pan. Without a word, she rolled up her sleeves, grabbed a cloth, and smothered the flame with the ease of someone who belonged in a kitchen like this. Every movement was calm, precise, free of hesitation. Hank stood still, taken off guard, not by the ruined eggs, but by her eyes when they met his, steady, deep, free of judgment or fear, an expression he hadn't seen directed at him in years. "Mr. Mercer, if you'll allow me, I'll make breakfast again," she said, her voice low and even. Her hand brushed his as she took the pan. Just a faint touch, but sharp enough to tighten something inside him, like reins suddenly pulled. He stepped back, surprised at himself more than anything else. Althea washed the pan, rebuilt the fire, chopped onions, cracked eggs, each task flowing into the next, with such ease that Hank found himself leaning against the table, watching her take command of his kitchen as if it had always been hers. When the smell of warm butter filled the room, his stomach growled loud enough for Miguel and Josiah, the ranch hands, to poke their heads in, their faces brightening like boys finding candy. "Good Lord, there's no way that smell came from Mr. Mercer," Josiah whispered. Althea set the soft golden eggs on the table. Hank took a bite. He paused. "Good," he said. A plain word, but his voice had a rough edge to it. Thomas planted his hands on his hips and nodded, pleased. "She needs work. You need real food. Sounds fair to me." Hank looked at Althea. She stood steady, chin slightly raised, eyes calm, not timid, not pleading, simply a woman determined to start over by doing what she did well. "Charleston left me with things I'd rather not keep," she said. "I only want a place to work hard and live honest." Hank heard something in her voice, not sorrow, but pride that had been hurt, not broken. It was a feeling he knew too well, but he also knew Las Cruces was not kind to a black woman on her own. He hesitated. "I don't want you catching trouble for choosing to work here. Folks will." Althea held his gaze, her eyes soft but unwavering. "I'm done running from talk, Mr. Mercer. I choose freedom. If this place offers honest work, I'll stay." Silence stretched. A thin breeze slipped through the kitchen door. Hank found himself nodding before he had fully decided. "All right, stay." Althea smiled, small, but warm enough to light the old kitchen. When she stepped out back to look over the side kitchen, Hank watched her go. He didn't know why it felt as if someone had just shifted the course of his day, or maybe the course of his life. What he didn't see was Althea pausing at the doorway, turning her head for a single quiet glance at him, her eyes soft in a way words couldn't catch. One fire, one breakfast saved, one woman searching for a place to stand, one rancher unaware he had opened more than a kitchen door. Fateful moments always come in quiet ways. Some changes come so quietly that a man notices them only when he looks back. For Hank Mercer, that change began with a clean kitchen and a woman who brought a quiet warmth into a wooden house that had known too much silence. 3 days after Althea Rivers arrived at Mercer Ranch, Hank realized he had forgotten what a proper meal felt like. No more charred meat, no more coffee thick as mud, no more smoke clinging to the table. Instead came the smell of fresh bread, warm corn soup, and soft spice lingering around the kitchen. Each morning, when he stepped through the kitchen door, he found Althea by the stove, her back straight, her presence calm and steady. And when he reached for the coffee, her hand would brush his, a light touch that stole a breath from him every time. He covered his reaction with a cough, while Althea only tilted her head and gave a small smile, so small that Hank sometimes wondered if he imagined it. Althea changed too, little by little. At first she stayed quiet, her gaze drifting toward the fields as if they held stories she refused to open. But those moments grew fewer. Soon she laughed at Miguel's jokes, hummed softly while rinsing rice in the backyard, and let the breeze carry her voice across the yard. One noon, Hank walked past the kitchen and found her tying her headscarf. When she turned, her shoulder brushed his arm. It lasted a heartbeat, yet it struck him like a warm hand pressed to his chest. He stepped back. She smiled, her cheeks a shade warmer, but she didn't pull away the way most would around a man like him. Life on the ranch shifted with her. Miguel and Josiah worked harder, eager to finish early for one of Althea's dinners. Hank came home sooner without realizing it. Evenings no longer sat heavy and silent. Althea spoke of Southern cooking. Hank told childhood stories, like the time he tried to break a wild horse and ended up dragged half a mile. Althea laughed until her eyes watered, while Hank sat there watching her, lighter than he had felt in years. One night, after cleaning up, Althea sat at the small table with her hand resting on a sealed white envelope. Hank sat across from her, holding a cup of warm tea. "You're thinking of your father again?" he asked quietly. Althea nodded. "He's in Boston, a professor at Harvard. I haven't written since I left Charleston, and I know he worries." Her voice was soft, but something dimmed in her eyes. Hank set his cup down. "Then write him. Invite him here. Let him see this place, and know you're safe." Althea paused. "Mr. Mercer, you want my father to come to the ranch?" Hank didn't look away. "If he matters to you, then yes. Who matters to you matters to me." He realized he had spoken too plainly, but Althea didn't shy from his eyes. She simply looked at him, long enough for something steady and gentle to settle between them. "Thank you, Hank," she said, her voice moving as softly as wind across the fields. He turned his face aside to hide the uneven beat in his chest. That night, Althea wrote her letter. Hank sat on the porch, listening to her pen move across the paper. Neither spoke. Yet the silence held a warmth that told Hank something he had missed for years. Someone else lived in this house and cared. When Althea stepped outside and handed him the sealed letter, her fingers brushed the back of his hand. Both stopped for a breath. "Could you send it in the morning?" she asked. "Of course," he said, his voice low, unable to mask the softness in it. The next morning, Hank rode to the town post. As he handed off the letter, he knew something new had begun. A steady, warm rhythm that carried a quiet danger. It opened his heart without warning. The letter left his hand and drifted into the dust of New Mexico. And in that same moment, another journey began in silence. The rain came without warning that afternoon, turning the path by the stables into a broad stretch of mud. Hank had told Althea to stay inside, but she still tried to help Miguel clear the slick ground near the entrance, worried the horses might slip in the dark. By the time Hank reached her, her dress was soaked through, her hair plastered to her neck, her hands trembling from the cold. He caught her by the wrist. "You need to get inside." But Althea stayed a moment longer, finishing the last bit of work, and that small stubbornness was all it took for the fever to slip in like a sharp wind. That night, Hank heard a rough cough from the small room beside the kitchen. When he stepped in, he found Althea curled beneath a blanket, breath heavy, her forehead burning. She tried to open her eyes, but her lids fell shut almost at once. "Althea?" He spoke low. No answer. Only the broken rhythm of her breathing. A surge of fear, the kind he had never felt even during droughts or wild animal attacks, rose in him. He fetched cold water, clean cloths, and the wooden chair he used when chopping kindling. All night, the lamplight cast his shadow long across the wooden wall, still as a sentinel keeping watch. He laid the cold cloth on her brow, wiped the sweat sliding down her temples, brushed damp strands of hair from her cheek. His hand stayed near hers, not because he thought she needed it, but because he did. He needed to know she was there. Each time her breathing grew heavier, Hank leaned closer. Each time she moaned in fevered sleep, he placed his hand over hers, gripping it as though afraid she might disappear. The little room was small, but that night it became Hank Mercer's entire world. Near midnight, Althea stirred. A faint sigh left her lips, and her hand drifted toward the edge of the bed. Hank was bending to change the cloth when her fingers brushed his wrist. The touch was soft as a whisper. Hank froze. In that moment, he was no longer the stoic rancher of the West. He was a man terrified of losing the first woman who had ever made his wooden house feel less empty. Her hand moved weakly, searching. Then her fingers slipped into his, a natural gesture, as if their hands had known each other far longer than the few weeks they had shared this ranch. Hank bowed his head, exhaling a breath he hadn't realized he had been holding. "I'm here, Althea. Don't worry," he murmured, his voice so quiet it might have vanished if the night hadn't been so still. She gave no reply, only the fragile sound of her breathing. But her hand did not let go. By dawn, the fever began to break. When Althea opened her eyes, early sunlight cut through the doorway and fell on the man slumped against the side of her bed, sleeping from sheer exhaustion. His hand still held hers, steady through the night. Althea watched him for a long while. The warm light touched his brown hair. His lashes flickered with restless dreams. And the heat from his hand, A warmth she had not expected to trust so deeply lingered between them. She didn't wake him. She only tightened her fingers around his. Hank's eyes opened. The first thing he saw was her dark, steady gaze, clear now, soft, grateful. "You're awake," he breathed, almost shaking with relief. Althea's voice was faint. "Hank, thank you." In that moment, he wanted to say everything, that he had been afraid, that he had never stayed up all night for anyone, that he didn't know when her presence had become the most important thing on the ranch. But he only nodded. "Rest a little more. I'll stay." She looked at him for a long time. Hank knew that look would stay with him for the rest of his life. That evening, when he stepped onto the porch for air, Miguel handed him a letter. A reply from Boston. Must be from her father. Hank held the envelope, glancing at the lamplight spilling from Althea's room, then at the wide, empty New Mexico sky. Whatever lay written inside would likely change everything. And Hank understood one truth clearly. Something had shifted the moment her hand clasped his in fevered sleep. It wasn't the illness that had shaken him. It was the thought of losing her. Something he now knew he could not bear. The town of Los Cielos was quieter than usual that afternoon, the gray sky carrying a warning of its own. Hank had taken Althea to buy a few supplies, a way to get her out of the ranch after days of recovering. She was still weak, but strong enough to want to see people again, hear the noise of the street, and feel the warmth of life moving around her. They had barely stepped out of the general store when a horse stopped in front of the saloon at the end of the street. A tall man in a dark Eastern suit, his face sharp and familiar, stepped down. Althea froze. Her breath slowed. Hank saw her shoulders tighten, the kind of reaction he never wanted to see in her. Edgar Blackwell, the man who had let her walk away without lifting a single word in her defense. Edgar hadn't noticed them yet. He walked straight into the saloon, his boots striking the wooden floor with an impatient rhythm. Althea stood still for a few seconds, then swallowed the rising knot in her throat. "I'm fine," she whispered, though Hank had not asked. Hank nodded lightly. He didn't touch that wound. He simply stood beside her, steady as a porch post holding up a roof in a winter storm. But fate, never fond of leaving people in peace, made Edgar turn just as Althea stepped away, his gaze locked on her like a hunter spotting lost prey. "Althea?" His voice dipped from surprise into disdain. "So it really is you. You look fitting for a place like this, dusty and low." Hank heard the last word clearly. He didn't need to look to know Althea was holding her expression still. Edgar stepped closer. When he sensed Hank beside her, he cast a sidelong glance and smirked. "And who is this? Your master now?" Althea gripped her skirt. Hank rested a hand on her back, not pulling her, not shielding her, only letting her know he was there. "She belongs to no one," Hank said, slow and clear, his voice steady as riverbed stone. "And you'd better watch your words." Edgar lifted an eyebrow, amused. "Oh, I forgot. You Western men wouldn't know proper decorum. I am her lawful fiancé. A man has rights." Althea raised her head. "You have no rights over me, Edgar. We ended. I left. You know that." Edgar gave a low laugh, threaded with poison. "You think you left out of pride? People in Boston are talking a great deal, Althea. Running away before the wedding. The rumors aren't kind." Hank felt her shoulders tremble just once. He straightened, stepping half an inch closer to her like a silent shield. Edgar glanced at Hank and lowered his voice. "We'll see what your father thinks when he reads my letter. A black woman running off with some western stray. That's a story worth telling." Althea's face drained of color. Hank didn't shout, didn't swing a fist, but his eyes sharpened like a newly honed saw. "You won't do that," Hank said. "Not if you have a shred of decency." Edgar scoffed. "Decency? In this dust pit? You people don't understand anything. But I'll be sure her father hears the truth. Or at least, what will shame him most." Althea drew in a sharp breath as though someone had taken the last air from her. Hank placed his hand on her shoulder. Warm, firm, steady. She leaned into him without thinking. A small gesture, but to Hank, it felt like a great trust handed to him. "That's enough, Edgar. Stay away from her," Hank said, eyes locked on him. Edgar looked at the two of them, recognizing the quiet closeness between them. Something dark flickered in his gaze. "We'll see. I won't let you slip away from the Blackwell name so easily, Althea." He turned, mounted his horse, and rode off in a scatter of dust. When he disappeared at the far edge of town, Althea stood silent, not from fear, but from being dragged backward into the past she had fought so hard to leave. Hank stayed beside her, not asking, not rushing her. After a long moment, Althea whispered, "I have to write to Father. Tell him everything, before Edgar twists it." Hank nodded. "I'll take you home." That night, Althea wrote at the table under lamplight. Hank stood on the porch, watching her shadow move on the wooden wall, the shape of a woman who was alone but no longer trembling. When she stepped out and handed him the letter, her shoulder brushed his arm. A small touch, but full of trust. "Hank, thank you for standing with me." He shook his head slowly. "Not standing with you. Standing on the right side." She looked at him, her eyes warming in quiet depth. The town lay peaceful that night, but Hank knew. Edgar Blackwell had not left their story for good. The storm from the past had only begun. The letter from Boston arrived on a mild morning, just as Althea finished laying out the tablecloth for breakfast. Hank brought the mailbag from town as he always did, but today his hand gripped it tighter than usual. He set the envelope stamped with the Harvard seal on the table and looked at her with a tension he tried to hide. Althea took the letter with both hands, her heartbeat so loud she feared Hank could hear it. She opened it carefully, and her father's familiar handwriting came into view. Her eyes brightened with each line. "Father is coming to New Mexico." Her voice trembled, carrying a joy she rarely let slip. Hank let out a breath, light as someone lifting a stone off his chest. "He'll like it here," he said. Althea looked up, meeting his gaze. Warm, protective, and edged with a very human worry. "I'm not sure, Hank." He's used to Boston, to lecture halls and libraries that reach the ceiling. And this place, open plains, harsh sun, dust roads. "But you're here," Hank said, his voice low and steady. For him, that's enough. A quiet settled between them. Althea lowered her gaze, hiding a smile tugging at the corner of her eyes. That afternoon, Althea spent hours preparing a room for her father. The small corner room faced the creek running along the hill. She replaced the old curtain with a light blue one she had sewn, but when she tried to hang it, she couldn't reach. Hank walked by and found her standing on a chair, arms stretched high, back arched. He stepped in immediately. Let me. He stood behind her and lifted the curtain rod into place. For a moment, the space between them shrank to the length of a single breath. When he lowered his arms, his forearm brushed her shoulder. A brief touch, as soft as wind over skin, yet enough to stop both of them. Althea felt the warmth of it, a thin line of heat running down her spine. She stepped back, not from shyness, but because her heart had kicked too hard. Hank turned awkwardly, searching for a safe sentence. "Curtains up," he said, like a man who had just saved an entire harvest. Althea let out a soft laugh. It was light and warm, and it set a slow burn in Hank's chest. After supper, Althea decided to bake a batch of cookies to welcome her father. Hank rolled up his sleeves and offered to help. She handed him a bowl of dough and guided his hands. Not too hard. Slow. Feel it. Yes, like that. Their fingers brushed when she corrected his grip. When she leaned down to check the dough, her hair slipped along her cheek, and Hank, without realizing when it happened, was used to being close enough to hear her breathing. She lifted her head, her face only inches from his. Warm kitchen. Quiet night. Shared breath. Then Hank made the smallest mistake. He said something true. "I need you." He swallowed but didn't look away. "Not just in the kitchen." Althea froze. Only for a moment. But in turn, that moment, something dropped and settled in her chest at the same time. Her breath broke faintly. Hank knew he had spoken too plainly, but he didn't retract it. He simply stood there, honest in a way that carried risk. Althea opened her mouth. Something important was about to form, when a knock shattered the thin moment. Thomas Wilson poked his head in, cheerful as ever. "News! Althea, your father already left Boston. 3 days ago. He's on his way sooner than we thought." Althea hurried out to greet him, hiding her flushed face. Hank stayed behind, caught between relief and regret. Thomas, oblivious, rambled about train schedules and arrival dates. But Althea's glance toward Hank, quick, shy, warm, said something else. "What you said. I heard it. And I'm not afraid." After Thomas left, Hank leaned against the kitchen doorway. Althea cleaned up slowly, her movements not quite as steady as usual. No one mentioned the unfinished words. But the kitchen, the wind, and the night all knew. Something had shifted for good. And her father was already on his way to the place where everything had begun. Hank Mercer left the ranch early, riding toward Santa Fe to meet Professor Rivers. The sky still held streaks of indigo from the night, but something unsettled moved in Hank's chest. Maybe it was nervousness, maybe fear, maybe hope. The long ride was quiet, and Hank tried to prepare the words he would say when he met Althea's father. But when he saw the man standing at the station, a tall figure, gray at the temples, eyes deep and calm like Althea's, every planned sentence dissolved into dust. "Mr. Rivers? You're Hank Mercer? She wrote plenty about you." His tone carried no judgment, no coldness, only the weight of a father searching the truth in the man before him. On the road back to the ranch, they talked about weather, land, schooling, the books the professor was writing. Then the conversation turned, as it always did, toward Althea. "My daughter, she is at peace here, isn't she?" Hank tightened his grip on the reins. "Sir, she brought peace to this place. I only try to keep it." Professor Rivers studied him for a long moment, the wind ruffling his hair. "You love her?" He said it so softly, Hank almost thought he misheard. Hank didn't deny it, didn't hide it. I think I love her more than I ever understood myself. There was no rebuke, no uneasy silence, only a steady reply. Then let her choose. She's been pushed by society her entire life. Don't be another man who limits her. That evening, after a simple, warm meal, Althea led her father to the guest room she had prepared. When she returned to the kitchen, Hank stood in the doorway, the lamplight pulling his shadow long across the wooden floor. They looked at each other. That alone made both their hearts shift. Did he like the room? Hank asked quietly. He did. Her voice was soft, her smile touched by a quiet joy. No one mentioned Edgar, the letter, or the past. Instead, when she stepped out to the porch for fresh air, Hank followed. No agreement, no words needed. The New Mexico sky opened wide above them like a dark velvet cloth. The moon hung low to the south, its pale light falling across Althea's hair, giving her a beauty Hank had never seen before. The night carried the scent of dry grass and cedar, a silence so pure it felt dangerous to break it. Althea. Hank's voice was deeper than usual, more honest. She turned. Their eyes met like two streams meeting in a quiet bend of the river. I'm afraid, Hank, she said softly. Afraid they'll see me the way they used to. Afraid my father will be disappointed. Afraid I am unworthy of what I want. Hank stepped closer. You owe no explanation to this world. You chose to live, to stand with dignity, to rise from things no one should endure. No one has the right to judge you. The wind lifted the scarf on her shoulders. Hank reached to steady it. His hand touched her shoulder, warm enough to pull a faint, trembling breath from her. And what is it you want? He asked. Althea looked at him, her eyes bright like moonlight breaking on water. I want a place to return to, a man to trust, a shoulder that won't leave me when I falter. Hank placed a hand on her cheek, slow, careful, as if afraid she might vanish into the night. Then lean on me, if you want to, if you choose. The air between them stilled. Then Althea stepped forward. One step, another, until she set her hand on his chest, right where his heart beat too fast. I choose, she whispered, soft yet unshakable. Hank bent toward her, slowly, to let her change her mind. But Althea didn't move away. Their first kiss came like moonlight falling on earth, unhurried, deep, warm with everything they had held back too long. A kiss that made them both tremble. Althea's arms rose around his neck. Hank pulled her close, holding her with everything he didn't know how to say. Breaths mingled, hearts hammered. Neither let go. Then Hank lowered his forehead to hers, his lips brushing her brow like a promise without sound. He took her hand. She tightened her fingers around his, and under the soft gold lamplight spilling from the kitchen, they stepped inside, together. The door closed gently. Two shapes merged in the warm glow like two souls finally finding home. No explanations needed, no permission asked. Only trust, only choice, and a night that changed them forever. By morning, the ranch lay under soft prairie sunlight. Althea reached the kitchen first, hair tied neatly, her face calm in a way that spoke of something gently mended. Hank entered moments later. Neither spoke. only one look. And that look told them both. There was no turning back. Neither wanted to. The next morning, the ranch looked no different than any other day. Pale sunlight falling across the yard, chickens scratching for food, the wind slipping through the stable doors. But to Professor Jonathan Rivers, something felt different the moment he stepped onto the porch. His daughter was making breakfast. It wasn't the cooking that caught his attention. It was the way she moved, light in her stance, calm in her steps, her face still soft from sleep, her eyes carrying a gentleness he could not mistake. Something like peace, a deep peace she had been without for too long. Hank appeared a moment later, hair slightly mussed, shirt not fully buttoned. No one said a word about it, but when their eyes met, just for an instant, Professor Rivers saw it clearly. His daughter was loved, and she loved in return. No explanation required. Throughout the day, he watched without interfering. He saw Althea laugh more than she had in years. She mentioned Hank's favorite dishes. She paused near where he worked, not to ask anything, but because she simply couldn't walk past. And Hank, the way Hank looked at her as if the rest of the world faded, that warmed the father's heart even as it tightened. Warmed because his daughter was cherished. Tightened because he would soon entrust her future to another man. By late afternoon, with the sun lowering behind the hills, he asked Hank to meet him behind the stables. They stood a few paces apart, the last light of the day stretching their shadows long across the ground. The wind carried the scent of dry grass. "How long have you loved her?" the professor asked, direct as always. Hank didn't try to dodge it. "I think, since before I realized it myself." "She loves you too," the professor said, not as a question, but as fact. Hank's hand curled slightly. "I'm only afraid I'll fail her, or pull her into a life too harsh." Professor Rivers' mouth tipped in the faintest smile, somewhere between sympathy and dry humor. "You think Boston is kinder than the West? The tongues there cut just as sharp. But my daughter, she lived under judgment all her life. This morning, when she greeted me, I saw a woman who could finally breathe." Hank bowed his head, something tightening in his throat. "You don't object?" he asked quietly. "We don't object to happiness," the professor replied. "But I need to know this, Hank Mercer. Will you walk with her to the end? Not just in a burst of feeling." Hank lifted his gaze, brown eyes steady as western earth. "I've never been sure of anything the way I'm sure of this. I want to protect her, walk beside her, build a home she'll never have to run from again." The wind paused, as if waiting for judgment. Then Professor Rivers exhaled. "I watched you since the day I arrived. The way you leaned over her when she was ill. The way you looked at her this morning. Careful as a man handles something precious. My daughter is safe with you. That is enough." Hank almost lost his breath. "Thank you," he said, plain and honest. But the professor didn't let him off so easily. "I have one more request." Hank straightened, ready to take it. "When she's hurting, don't let her carry the weight alone. She's used to enduring, used to saying she's fine. You have to see deeper than her words." Hank nodded slowly, his voice low. "I promise." Professor Rivers studied him a moment longer, then laid a hand on his shoulder. Light, but heavier than any spoken blessing. "Then I entrust her to you, not because you promised, but because she has already chosen. When they returned to the porch, Althea was watering the flowers. She looked at the two men, her father and Hank, as if she knew they had spoken of something important. Her face softened the moment Hank's gaze met hers. A small smile touched her lips, enough for Hank to understand. She saw her future in him, and now her father saw it too. In that same moment, Hank understood. From this day on, he was not loving Althea alone. He was loving her with the blessing of the man who raised her. And that made the feeling inside him steadier than the prairie earth itself. Santa Fe, that night, wore the stillness of a town long settled into sleep after a sun-soaked day. Lanterns glowed a soft gold above the shop fronts, and the wind carried the scent of pine and dry New Mexico earth. Hank and Professor Rivers sat outside a small coffee shop, where the owner stayed late to roast the last batch of beans. They didn't speak much at first. Only the clink of cups and the warm drift of coffee rose between them. But Hank knew tonight was the night he had to say what he had carried for months. Professor Rivers was the one who began. She loves this place, loves her new life, and loves you. He said it plainly, like a man naming an old star. Hank set his cup down, his large hands clasping together to steady himself. I know, and I don't take that lightly, sir. The professor tilted his head, listening with the calm patience of someone who had heard many truths and many lies. So, Hank Mercer, what is it you want to tell me tonight? Hank drew in a long breath. No hinting, no sidestepping. He met the man's eyes with a sincerity sharp enough to hear in his own heartbeat. I want to... He swallowed. I want to marry Althea. The words fell into the quiet space between them. They did not sink. They stood, solid, certain, long overdue. Professor Rivers didn't answer at once. He turned his cup lightly, letting the faint heat rise toward his face. You know marriage to her is more than loving her, don't you? Yes. Marriage means taking on every wound she carries from Charleston. Yes. And every look this town might give her when they learn. He left it hanging, but Hank understood. I won't let her face any of it alone, sir. Not a single part. The professor's gaze dipped, as if to hide the shift in his expression. Then how do you plan to protect her? You're a rancher. The work is harsh, lonely, and nothing is guaranteed. What do you offer her besides a good heart? Hank stayed silent for a moment. The wind passed, stirring the leaves along the porch. Then he spoke, slow, steady. I'm not wealthy. I'm not educated the way you are. I don't have fine houses or status to show. He lifted his eyes. But I have my life. I have these hands. And I'll use every breath in me to build a home where she never has to fear, never has to tremble, never has to run again. His voice firmed. I can't promise there won't be storms, but I can promise I'll stand in front of every one of them so she can be at peace. A breeze slipped through. The professor's cup trembled slightly, as if catching the feeling in the air. He set his hand on the table, a simple gesture, but enough to make Hank sit straighter. I lost my wife too early. I know what it is to love someone until your life knots itself into theirs. His gaze softened. And I see. Althea looks at you the way her mother once looked at me. Silence, stretched. This time, the silence of recognition. You have my blessing, Hank Mercer. Hank closed his eyes for a moment, steadying himself against the light, almost weightless rush inside. "Thank you, sir. Truly." The professor let out a low chuckle. "But don't think that's the end of it. When she's hurting, you must see it before she says a word. When she pushes herself too hard, remind her she can lean on you. When she laughs, learn what sits behind that laugh." Hank nodded. "I'll learn, for as long as it takes." When they left the coffee shop, Santa Fe lay quiet under the warm lamps. Before mounting his horse, Hank stopped at a small storefront at the end of the street, where simple rings hung in the window. He stepped inside, without hesitation. The shopkeeper looked up and smiled. "For someone special?" Hank only nodded. He chose a thin gold ring, uncarved, without gemstones, plain and lovely, like the way Althea smiled each morning. When he received the velvet box, his heart grew heavier, but not with fear. With the knowledge that he was stepping into a new part of his life, a part he had waited for longer than he had ever admitted. A part shaped by a woman strong enough and gentle enough to soften the heart of a hardened rancher, day by day. Hank returned in a late afternoon glow of burnt copper, the sun dropping behind the far hills. The trip to Santa Fe had taken longer than he expected, but never had he wanted to come home more than now. The dry dirt road leading to Mercer Ranch felt like a road that led straight into his own heart. Althea saw him from the porch. She didn't wait. She didn't hold to manners or the distance life had forced on her for so long. She ran down the steps, prairie skirt brushing in the wind, wooden clogs striking the boards. When she stopped before him, breath still sharp, her dark eyes fixed on him as if needing proof he was truly there. "You're home." Her voice was soft, but the relief in it tightened something in Hank's chest. He stepped down from the horse and moved closer, close enough that their breaths mixed in the warm dusk. "I told you I'd be back before night." "I know, but my heart kept worrying anyway." It was so honest, Hank had to turn his face away to hide the smile breaking through. That evening, after Professor Rivers retired early from travel fatigue, only the kitchen lamp and the wind across the porch remained awake. Althea and Hank stepped outside, standing shoulder to shoulder at the wooden railing. The New Mexico sky spread wide like a black ocean scattered with stars. The wind carried the scent of dry grass, earth, and the quiet of night. They did not speak at first. They didn't need to. The silence wasn't distance. It was closeness, the kind only shared by people who had already chosen one another. "Althea." Hank's voice was lower than usual. She turned to him, her face calm in the moonlight, eyes soft enough to shake the breath from his lungs. "Hank?" He drew in a long breath, not for courage, but because the truth inside him had grown too full to hold. "Since the day you stepped into my kitchen, I haven't lived the same." He lowered his gaze, his hand gripping the rail until his knuckles whitened. "I eat better, sleep better, the house is warmer, but that isn't the important part." Althea listened with her whole heart. "The important thing is, you made me into a man I want to be. Better, more patient, more honest." Hank paused, steadying his voice. "I never thought a rancher like me deserved anything beyond work and this land. But you came, and I started to believe I could build a life worth living. A meaningful one." Moonlight traced a soft line across Althea's face, making her eyes shine. "Hank, let me finish." He stepped closer. "I love you." Slowly, quietly, but as sure as the rock under our feet. He reached into his coat, His fingers shook, something that had happened only twice in his life, when his mother died, and now. He opened the small box. Inside lay the thin gold ring he had chosen in Santa Fe. Simple, beautiful in the way Althea lived. Althea Rivers. His voice deepened. Will you marry me? Not because the ranch needs you, not because I need a cook, but because I need you in every day I have left. Althea covered her mouth. Tears fell faster than she could wipe them. She cried, not loudly, not broken, just tears soft as night rain on a tin roof. Her shoulders trembled. Hank feared he had said the wrong thing, but she stepped into his arms, holding him so tightly he had to steady her with both hands. Yes. Her voice was choked but firm. Yes, Hank. I will. I will. Hank held her, the whole world sinking into her warmth. He rested his forehead against hers, and they stayed like that, breathing in the same rhythm. Let me put the ring on you, he whispered. She extended her hand, still shaking. Hank slid the ring onto her finger, perfectly fitted, as though made for that hand alone. When Althea looked at it, tears fell again, but this time they carried the stillness of peace. Then Hank leaned in. The kiss was long, steady, unhurried, a vow made without words, the meeting point of two lives finally finding their way home. The prairie wind swept past them, moonlight settled on their shoulders, and beneath that vast New Mexico sky, a promise was given. The small church of Las Cruces rested beneath the shade of two old cypress trees. On the morning of the wedding, the wind carried the scent of damp earth and a faint ring of the bell, as if the whole prairie wished to soften itself for their day. Althea Rivers stood behind the wooden door, her hands trembling around a bouquet of wildflowers Miguel had picked at dawn. She didn't speak or smile. She simply stood still and let her heartbeat thrum in a way she barely recognized. Her life had been made of judgment, stares, and whispered talk. But this morning, no one looked at her that way. Outside, the church was full. The blacksmith, the seamstress, the Donnelly family, the herders, even the rowdiest children in town sat quietly in their seats. They waited for her, not with curiosity, but with genuine blessing. The door opened. When Althea stepped out, the air fell silent for a long breath. Sunlight touched her dress, casting a shimmer like a thin veil. And Hank Mercer. He stood at the end of the aisle, eyes fixed on her without wavering. He wore a simple suit, the one he saved for only the most important days. But it wasn't the clothes that made him solemn. It was his gaze, the gaze of a man who had decided to give his whole life to the woman walking toward him. Althea felt her knees soften. Not from fear, but because no one had ever looked at her like that. It was a gaze that saw her, truly saw her, not her skin, not her past, not her scars. Just her. The minister spoke the blessing, a soft wind brushing through the rose outside. When Hank reached for her hand, Althea placed hers in his, like two pieces of land meant to fold into one. Do you take? Yes. Hank didn't wait for the sentence to finish. Laughter rippled through the guests, warm as a winter hearth. And do you? Althea lifted her head, her eyes shining with a light she had never carried before this day. Yes. The word was soft as breath, firm as stone. When Hank bent to kiss her, not long, not deep, just steady, the applause rose around them, honest and unpolished. The whole town stood to celebrate them, and for the first time in her life, Althea felt she belonged. Not because Hank loved her, but because they accepted her, and they accepted her happiness. The wedding feast took place at Mercer Ranch, beneath lanterns strung between the two cypress trees. The long tables were covered with dishes Althea had cooked for the town, and today they brought to repay the kindness. Fiddle music drifted through the yard, children ran in circles, and the adults raised their cups in cheer. Althea laughed through the whole meal, a laugh she couldn't hold back, like a stream finally finding its path. Hank stood a few steps away, speaking with Professor Rivers, but every time he turned toward her, her chest warmed as if the lanterns shone straight into her heart. At some point, through the music and laughter, Hank stepped to her side, leaned down, and murmured, "Walk with me." She didn't ask where. She simply placed her hand in his. They crossed the yard, the lantern light falling behind, heading toward the path by the stable, quiet enough to hear the wind tug at the tin roof and the soft shift of horses moving inside. In the gentle dark, Hank turned to her, placing his hands on her shoulders. No words at first. Only the way he looked at her. The moon hung full above them like a silver bowl. Its light washed over her face, making her look like part of the landscape, unjudged, unlost. Althea Mercer. He spoke her new name, slow as a vow. She let out a small, breathless laugh. "Is that my name now?" "Yes, from tonight, from the moment you said yes." They stood like that for a long moment. Then Hank bent to kiss her again, this time deeper, longer, not a promise anymore, but a complete acknowledgement. Her hands gripped his coat, their breaths tangled, not desire. A peace so deep it slowed both their hearts. Neither spoke, but under that night sky between the stable and the open stretching plains, they both knew. The wedding was only the ceremony. The true bond had been decided long before, and tonight they were simply living the truth their hearts had already chosen. The years passed like a soft stream sliding beneath the hill behind Mercer Ranch. No great upheavals, no loud turns of fate, yet those quiet years built the life Hank and Althea once never dared to imagine. Mercer Ranch was nearly twice its old size now. The grasslands grew richer, the cattle herds larger, a new stable rising on the western side. Folks passing through often said, "There's a woman there whose hands can make the land grow stronger." Althea only smiled. Hank looked at his wife as if they had spoken a simple truth. Mornings at the ranch began with laughter. Jamie, 6, and little Eleanor, 3, chased Miguel's Christmas pup across the yard. Eleanor laughed the loudest, a bright sound that made the whole prairie seem to wake. From the porch, Althea watched with a basket of herbs in hand, her gaze soft with the kind of love that anchored a life. Sometimes Hank stood behind her, arms circling her waist, sharing the moment without speaking. Other times he watched from a distance, taking in the still unbelievable sight of his wife, once terrified of every whisper, now steady as the land itself. The woman who once fled Charleston, who once trembled under gossip, who once lowered her eyes, now stood straight, sure, and carried a peace as natural as the smell of rain on soil. Althea was more than a rancher's wife. She became a quiet teacher to the young women of the region. On certain afternoons, the girls from town gathered in the backyard. They learned cooking from her, how to read the fire, how to slice vegetables lightly, how to turn a handful of herbs into a remedy gentler than anything at the general store. She taught with a soft voice, never scolding, guiding only by placing her hand over theirs. In those small classes were white girls, Mexican girls, black girls who came seeking work. No one cared about color on Mercer Ranch, not when Althea stood there. They saw only a woman who knew how to make life better through the smallest things. In the evenings when Hank returned from a long day's work, he always found the same sight. Lamplight glowing through the kitchen window, Althea's silhouette tilted over a pot, or guiding someone's hands through a task. He paused outside for a few seconds, letting her voice, quiet, soothing, lift the tiredness from him. He often stepped in and laid a hand on her back. Althea tilted her head with a soft smile. No need to ask anything. No need to explain. Only the knowing that he was home. Althea's father, Professor Rivers, had moved to Santa Fe 3 years earlier. Age, he said, shouldn't be spent far from grandchildren, and Santa Fe was closer to the ranch than any city he'd ever lived in. He visited at the end of each month, carrying books for Jamie and Eleanor. The children called him Papa John, clinging to him as if he were sunlight. Afternoons on the porch became a kind of ritual. Hank mending a saddle, Althea sorting herbs, the professor reading aloud to the children. Their laughter spread across the yard, becoming the ranch's own steady breath. Those were the moments that slowed Althea's heart. Once, watching her father rock Eleanor to sleep on his shoulder, Althea murmured, "If Mother were alive, she would be so happy." Hank didn't speak. He only tightened his hand around hers, a small gesture, the way he said, "I know," without words. From a woman who once lived on pain and escape, Althea had built a home. Not from wood or stone, but from patience, kindness, and quiet renewal. And Hank, a man who once believed he was meant only for hard ground and silence, now lived inside the laughter of 2 children and the warmth of the woman he loved more deeply than the wide prairie before him. Nothing grand, nothing dramatic. Only years soft as grass after rain. But those years built the most important thing, a family grateful for each sunrise and grateful for one another. The spring morning began with sunlight soft as a first breath. It touched the porch roof of Mercer Ranch, slid down the old boards, and fell on the patch of earth where young grass pushed up after the long winter. Hank Mercer stood there with a steaming cup of coffee in hand. He leaned against a porch post, watching his son, Jamie, now 8, chasing a yellow butterfly. The boy laughed so hard his small shoulders shook, the sound scattering into the wind like light beats on his father's heart. From inside the house came another sound, softer, deeper, more private, Althea's lullaby. She was soothing Eleanor, their second child, now 5. The tune slipped through the doorframe and reached Hank like a different kind of light of the place he belonged. He closed his eyes a moment, trying to hold the sound inside. Years ago, when he burned breakfast alone in the kitchen, he never knew life could be this quiet. The sound of hooves pulled him back. A horse stopped at the porch. Thomas Wilson dismounted, older now, more silver in his hair, yet still carrying the kind of smile the world never managed to dim. "Morning, Hank," he called, lifting a thick envelope. "News from Santa Fe. Your father-in-law." Hank took it, a steady warmth rising in his chest. "Come in. Althea will want to read it with us." Thomas stepped inside, removed his hat, breathed deep as if the house itself eased his lungs. Althea had just laid Eleanor in her cradle. She turned, smiling when she saw him. "You're here early." Had to be, Thomas said with a grin. Your father wrote plenty. They gathered around the wooden table. Jamie climbed onto a chair, trying and failing to hide his excitement. Hank handed the letter to Althea, as he always did, letting her open any news tied to her past, a quiet way of honoring the pieces of life that shaped her. Her slender fingers trembled slightly as she broke the seal. She read each line, then stopped, then lifted a hand to her mouth, steadying her breath. Father, we'll visit next week, she whispered. He'll stay a full month. Thomas laughed. I figured he misses the little ones. But Hank watched Althea's eyes, a place where old memories stirred. She sat down and placed the letter on the table gently, as if it were too precious to hold. The day I left Charleston, she said, voice low, I thought I'd lost my family, lost my future, lost everything. I never imagined there would come a day when my father would come to a place I call home. Jamie wrapped his arms around her, sensing everything and nothing at once. Thomas rested a hand on her shoulder. Hank stood behind her, full of words he didn't know how to speak. She smiled then, soft, unsteady, but honest. When Thomas left and the children ran outside, Hank leaned against the doorway and watched Althea adjust a bundle of herbs near the stove. Nothing remarkable in the motion, just her familiar posture, her neatly tied hair, her patient hands. But to Hank, it was the image of peace he could not imagine living without. He stepped behind her, wrapped his arms around her waist, slowly, steadily, the way he had from the first days they belonged to one another. She leaned back into him, knees softening as always. What are you thinking? She asked quietly. Thinking about the morning you arrived, he said. The burnt pan, the burnt eggs, my whole life burning right along with them. She laughed softly. Hank bent to kiss her hair. Outside, the noon sun fell across the yard where Jamie chased butterflies and Eleanor chased her own shadow. Althea turned to face him, laying her hand on his chest. They looked at each other a long while, as if seeing every year they had weathered. Nothing dramatic, only change. A change so deep they could feel it more than name it, felt in the way they stood side by side on the land they had built through care, patience, and quiet rebirth. The sky was clear. The wind was gentle. Life was steady. And on the porch of Mercer Ranch, Hank held Althea as if holding his whole life, quiet, deep, and beautiful as spring after a long storm. If this story brings back a memory of a love you once lived, or someone who walked beside you through long years, or simply the warmth of an older time, please share your thoughts below. And if you wish to keep journeying through stories like this, consider leaving a like and subscribing. In the next tale, you may find a piece of your own heart again.